To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, here we are again. Good evening or good morning, whatever time you're listening to this. This is our podcast, Islands at War, with myself, Keith Bengelli, and my co-presenter, Nick Lahiri. How are you, Nick?
I'm very good, Keith. How are you?
I'm fine. So those of you that are kind enough to follow us and listen to our podcast, you're aware that what we're doing is following the German occupation of the bailiwick of Guernsey through every month, which will go from, or has started from June 1940 and will go through to at least May-June 1945. That's the premise. Okay, so Nick, we're in September 1940 now. The islanders getting used to the occupation as much as they can. I like to look at social and civilian affairs. The islanders have not yet had their radios withdrawn, which we'll get to later. Can you give us some thoughts on how the islanders are viewing the world at large at this stage in the war?
Sure. I mean, They still have their radios, as you said earlier on. They are able to listen to the BBC unrestricted and can continue listening to that until the radios are taken away later on. So you know they've got a fairly good idea, and it actually makes them laugh because the Guernsey Press and the Star, the two newspapers, are being forced to print German propaganda on the front pages, which is well at odds with what they're hearing on the BBC. So it does give them a little bit of amusement, if you can have amusement during the course of the occupation.
Yes, I mean, for example, September 1940, the Battle of Britain is in progress, and I think it's generally accepted that the Blitz started on the 7th of September. So already our population here on the island, excuse me, must be starting to worry about how the Battle of Britain is progressing, and then the Blitz, because they wouldn't necessarily be aware of where their families that have evacuated have been distributed to and how they're faring under the Blitz. So, you know, this must be very worrying for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst I mentioned that, you know, they found some of the things amusing that the Germans were printing versus what the BBC was saying, they were obviously concerned about family members. They had no idea where people were unless they knew that they were going to make their way to other family members that were already in the UK. In fact, there were cases where, you know, but people who left on some of the later boats, it took them a month to find their family in the UK because they'd already been moved up north or you know, gone to somebody who wasn't a member of their family, so they had to track them down. You even see adverts in newspapers just looking for family members or news of family members. So they must have been very worried about what was going on. Not least, was England going to be invaded? Was this going
exactly.
Was this going to become a permanent thing, or not? They were quite aware of what was going on in the Battle of Britain from their radios, and of course seeing the RAF over the islands as well.
Can I just go back to the evacuees? It's worth mentioning that the two distribution points seem to be the Oldham area of Manchester and also Glasgow. I think those were the two predominant points.
Yeah, a lot of people ended up in Yorkshire as well, around Barnsley and those sort of areas. Also around Bradford Way. People got around a little bit, but yeah, they were moved up north to try and get away from exactly what was happening, which was the bombing of the southern part.
Yes, I mean, recently I interviewed a gentleman called Walter Breyer, who's still with us, is in his 90s. He was taken from evacuated from the Torterville area of Guernsey, which is our western parishes. It's our most rural parish even now. And the reason that Walter went away as an adolescent is effectively he had to act as a translator for the younger children in his school who only spoke the Guernsey patois, who didn't yet speak English.
Yeah, that was quite interesting. the reaction of the people when some of the evacuees turned up, because they'd actually assumed that none of them would speak English. So we're a little bit surprised when quite a few of them could.
Now that's an interesting thing, because I'd never thought of that. So people in the UK in the 40s thought that people coming from the Channel Islands might speak a different language.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
An obvious thing, but it never occurred to me before. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that's quite funny is on my grandfather on my father's side, I've got his military records, and when he enlisted, they put on his nationality alien, because he wasn't British. You know, you normally just see British on there, or Canadian or whatever if they signed up for the British forces, but they wrote alien.
Yeah, all of those years before Brexit. What a surprise. Okay, so also September 1940, Nick, marks the first anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War, obviously 3rd of September 1939. What was the evidence of British involvement with the Channel Islands at that stage? I mean, we'll go on to talking about some more spies that came ashore, but there was a regular RAF presence over the island, according to one of the diarists, Reverend Ord.
Yeah, absolutely, and I've looked into this because there are multiple sources that you can pick up information about RAF activities around the Channel Islands. A good starting point is aircraft losses, which helps you track down some of the squadrons that were involved. I'm pleased to say, actually, that the RAF didn't really lose very many aircraft in the early part of the war around the Channel Islands. But this will be a good one for the folks that are starting the Nevermind the Dam Busters podcast, which is out shortly. So you do go and have a look for that, because I know James Jeffries, who's one of the hosts, is a particular fan of the Blenheim. They were very active around the Channel Islands with Blenheims. We talked last month about the bombing of the airport. That was Blenheim's. 236 Squadron, which was part of Coastal Command, they flew Blenheims, and they were operating reconnaissance missions around Guernsey and the Channel Islands and down to the top of Brittany. They 3-4 times a day sometimes. I've looked at the squadron logs. They were frequently doing that. And actually on the 25th September, they shot down a German flying boat, a Dornier DO-18, which they saw the 5 guys getting out into a raft, but actually one of them didn't survive. The others were picked up.
And you mentioned, I'm not going to say a rival podcast, because we don't see ourselves in that way. This is Lydia Jane and
James Jeffries, yeah. So they're doing a podcast about Bomber Command, and I think it's going to be really, really good.
I'm sure it will be. What we'll do is we'll give a shout out to that at the end of this podcast again.
Sure.
There's some more details up there. Okay, returning to the RAF, they were dropping leaflets during September for the first time, called News from England #1. I think it contained a message from the King.
Yeah, it did contain a message from the King to try and cheer people up. They had a bit of a problem as when they dropped them. There was a bit of a lack of wind, so not many got to see those. More were dropped in October, but there's a sort of funny story about these actually, which I came across only the other day, where a gentleman called Leslie Russell was working in his garden, and he'd actually acquired some of these leaflets because they'd dropped in a field just down the road, and he'd toddled off with his wheelbarrow, picked them up and taken them back to his house, and he had them, and word got around, which is probably fairly dangerous, but word got around amongst some of his trusted friends that he had these, and people were popping around to his house to see if they could get one. There was a tale of a milkman who was actually selling them, but the Leslie Russell was actually very meticulous, because he was a bit worried about getting caught, so he went back and brushed the road to get rid of the tyre marks from his wheelbarrow before he did anything else, just to make and made sure that there was no trace of him having done that. But he was working in his garden shortly afterwards, and this Germans were billeted in the house next door to him, and this German came out and wasn't looking very happy, and he doesn't know if he was swearing, but he suspects he was probably swearing in German, and he kept putting his hand on his injured neck, saying leaflets, leaflets, and it would appear. Now, I don't know if you know, they were dropped in almost like a barrel, a small barrel type thing.
Okay, so they weren't loose, or they weren't just bundled up. They actually the leaflets were in a container.
Yeah, they're in a what looks like a very small beer keg almost. But the idea was that would break when it got on the ground and the leaflets would blow around. But it turns out this German had actually been hit on the head by one of these dropping through the roof of the house next door when he was asleep, which provided a little bit of amusement for the locals.
Okay, so the Germans' general response to these leaflets then, I mean, I read in Duran's diary, Ralph Duran's diary, that the Germans were sort of chasing around in several of the localities in Guernsey, brandishing revolvers to stop people picking up these leaflets. I mean, it must have looked a bit like hello, hello.
It was very amusing for the children. I've seen accounts from children that sat on the sea wall watching them run around, like almost. If you're old enough to remember some of the old black and white silent movies that they used to put on the TV, where they go, you've got Keystone cops chasing people down the road. I think it was a little bit like that from the descriptions that I've seen. The kids found it hilarious, but obviously it was a bit of a hazardous thing to do but the Germans were desperate to collect all of these leaflets. They just didn't want people getting them.
And yet, when you think about it, it's running in parallel with people being able to listen to BBC broadcasts anyway. And put a lot of effort into stopping people picking a bit of paper up, but no effort at this stage to stop the BBC broadcasting the truth or at least British propaganda into people's living rooms. Okay, now also one of the things that I picked up from the Guernsey Press from September 1940, Guernsey Press being one of the two newspapers which we previously mentioned, the Labour Office here were encouraging women and young ladies to pick blackberries and apples.
Yeah, that's back to the shortage of people to actually do any sort of farm work or anything like that, because most of the men had gone away who were of military age. They'd all, most of those had got away from the island and gone and enlisted. Quite a few of them well before before June 1940. A lot of people started enlisting in September 39, October 39.
Yes, in fact, at this stage, Nick, it might be worth reiterating the numbers of servicemen or people that went to join the services, because we've attracted the Channel Islands have attracted a little bit of flack from a so-called journalist in the last few days on Twitter.
So there were about 10,000. I haven't got the exact number, but it is north of 10,000 that went. Many were actually already in the services anyway.
Like my grandfather.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a lot. My grandfather was also in the Royal Navy already. He joined up in 1936 as boy service. But so they went fairly quickly. So I think we talked briefly about them bringing in the conscription law here because of the difficulties between the legislation in the UK and here. By the time they got it in, it was a waste of time anyway, because everybody had already gone who was going to join up. There were very few people left of military age, and that was only the ones that were unfortunate enough that they got stuck here because they couldn't get the later boats that were promised because the Germans had arrived. Yes,
and this particular gentleman that's queried let's just say something. I think he seems to be querying the fact that maybe Channel Islanders, young men of military age, were reluctant to serve in the British services, and I think there's always behind this sort of nonsense, a sort of wish to infer some form of collaboration. As you say, combined Channel Island population prior to the war, something like between 75 and 80,000.
Yeah, thereabouts.
And then so 10,000 rejoin or join up. So you can work that out. If you take away the children and the women, it's not that many men of military age that didn't go away.
You've got to bear in mind as well, the First World War, an awful lot of people, men from Guernsey, were unfortunately killed during the First World War. Not least those that were in the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry.
Yes, I mean, you only have to travel through each parish in Guernsey to look at the war memorials to absorb the amount of young men that laid those down those lines. So it's very disappointing to see this gentleman on Twitter question possibly the probity of Guernsey's young, or the whole of the Channel Islands' young men at the time of the opening of the First World War. Hopefully we can help put that to bed once and for all.
Second World War.
Second World War, sorry, I said first.
I know we've just mentioned the First World War, but...
Yeah, well, I think we can both agree that gentleman got under our skin a little bit in the last few days. Anyway, onwards. And on that note, possibly, a boat escape on the 27th of September. 8 men attempted to get away.
Yeah, they successfully got away. They got away from Bordeaux. So
north of the island.
North of the island, not the place in France. They got away from there, but one of the reasons that they went, Frederick Hockey, who was the chap who organised this, along with some other people. One of the reasons he gives in a newspaper interview in the UK, and this is quite unusual because whilst there were some really short interviews in the early days, so the people that got away in the first couple of days of the occupation, that you see some short write-ups in national newspapers, not very much, but perhaps 2 or 3 paragraphs, not very much. Frederick Hockey and the men that escaped with him actually had they had a very short write-up to start off with, and then somebody picked up on this and they actually wrote a series of articles over the space of a week, giving over pretty much a whole page of the newspaper to him escaping and the story of the escape, what was going on, what it was like with the Germans being here and things like that. But one of the reasons that he gave for escaping was the overt charm offensive that the Germans were on. He just couldn't stand the fact that they were, trying to be nice for propaganda reasons. They were trying to be nice, and that just really irked him. The other thing one of the other reasons that he gave for escaping was even more British. He'd gone into a cafe with his son, and they sat down, and some Germans who came in after them basically insisted on being served first. So he was annoyed that he didn't get his cup of tea before the Germans. That was one of the other reasons he gives that tipped him over the edge. He also had family that were in the UK, so he wanted to get to see them.
Yeah, so Frederick Hockey, I mean, we should perhaps remind our listeners that many men had boats here on the island. We're a little island, and so many people had experience of putting to sea, shall we put it that way. So Frederick Hockey worked as a signalman at St. Peter Port Harbour, so he was a man from the maritime world. He went with his 3 sons, and you've got here that in the notes you provided me, the remainder of the people that went, the men, part of that crew of 8, they were all tomato growers, etc. But when these boats arrived in the UK, I mean, people just weren't able to walk freely away from their ditched boat. They had to undergo a form of screening, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were sometimes stopped by launches outside of the harbours. They refer to some of the accounts as customs launches. I'm not sure that that's exactly what they were, but they had obviously patrolling boats out there. But interestingly, they sometimes they turn up and they can't get anybody's attention to actually enter the port. So they then go off and try somewhere else. But I think one thing about this that amazes me, and I know we've just said that Frederick Hockey had experience of the sea. But we've got to remember they were doing this in 20-foot long open boats.
Exactly.
Which must have been very cosy with 8 people in, let alone the fact you've not got the luxury of GPS or anything else like that to navigate by.
No, and also there would have been overflights by German aircraft, and there would have been the traffic on the seas at that time. So they were trying to get to Dartmouth or Brixton, because this is the sort of area. Guernsey, leaving St Peter Port, you go leaving Bordeaux rather north of the island, and you'd head over to the nearest piece of land, and that's in that sort of area.
Yeah,
and they didn't have charts, so they were sailing blind.
Yeah, they were sailing blind. You see that frequently in the accounts of those that did escape, because some of the ones that did escape, they'd hidden a boat because the boats got confiscated later on. But the only way that they knew how to navigate was they'd been, might have spoken to a fisherman who had been as far as Alderney, and we gave them a rough clue as to where they should be going. I just find it incredible, really. And
just keep going north in some respects, but then you've got the tidal conditions, etc.
Yeah.
And like I said, they didn't have charts because they never intended ever to go beyond our territorial waters.
Yeah.
In terms of fishing and crab and lobster pots.
Absolutely. I mean, the only way the population of Guernsey ever got to the UK was on the mail boat, and not very many people, travelled at that time for pleasure purposes. So it was only if they'd had a reason to go to England, and that was a nice big, comfortable steamer rather than being in a 20-foot open boat. As you say, the numerous accounts where the Germans were dropping flares and things, trying to catch them from aircraft because they knew they were there. But these guys, where they escaped from in Bordeaux, there were quite a few Germans in that area, albeit if they'd tried it a year later, they'd have been in more trouble because there were a lot of Germans patrolling that area.
Yes, and in fact, one of the things we'll look at, I think before the end of the calendar year, before 1940, Nick, is the difference between the defences at the start of the war, the field defences, from what they were to what they became at the Atlantic Wall. We'll have to do something quite detailed about that, because people come to Guernsey or Jersey or Alderney and see the masses of concrete that we've got, but this didn't start happening until 1942. So the defences early in the war were quite different to what they were in the middle of the war and at the end of the war. Of course, we'll get onto that in due course.
Their main risk with this escape was they were escaping from Bordeaux harbour, which the Germans had some patrols around that area just because it's a harbour and they wanted to keep it secure and make sure that people weren't escaping. Obviously, they weren't doing a very good job, albeit in September 1940 there weren't that many Germans here. No,
and of course they had to accumulate fuel for the engine, because they weren't sailing over, they were motoring over. Yep. And how much fuel do you need? I mean, how long's a bit of string, really, to those people, for all the reasons we've just given. I notice you've got a link to your blog that covers this off. I think you'll put that on the...
I'll put that on the show notes and also on the social media as well. So if you want to read about that in more detail, there's quite a long blog post about that and some photographs as well. Of Frederick Hockey and a few
his
of the
crew.
bits. Yeah, absolutely, and also some maps showing where they went. I mean, they went 87 miles roughly in this boat, but I just find it incredible. But they also had almost got caught when they were going to the harbour, but you can read all about that in the book.
Does it actually follow up? Give the ages. Did any of these 8 chaps then go into the services? Or
I've not looked, actually. I would imagine that they probably did.
I'll do some research around that.
Yeah, I've not looked at these individuals.
Okay, so moving away from that, Nick, it was seen pretty quickly at the start of the war that Guernsey would have to bring food in from outside, or the Channel Islands would have to bring food in from outside being German-occupied Europe, couldn't bring in supplies from England for obvious reasons. By now, in September, one of our diarists, one of our that we seek to gain knowledge of, Reverend Ord again, quite a lot of food is now coming in from France. Can you just give a sort of update on how this will sort of put into train? You know, we've already spoken about the controlling committee, and we had people purchasing food on the continent, and of course people were willing to sell it at that stage, weren't they?
Yeah, they were still able to sell food here that had been brought across from the continent. There was rationing though, so you couldn't just go out and buy everything that you particularly wanted. The purchasing people couldn't buy everything that they wanted in France, so sometimes they'd go off with their shopping list of things that they needed for the island, and they'd be told, no, you can't have these items on your list, we'll give you something else instead, which is might not be in any way helpful.
And so this food, how did it sort of arrive on the island? Was it coming on military transport, or there wasn't any civilian interaction between here and France, was it? Everything must have been military. Would that be the case?
Well, the Guernseymen and Jerseymen that were sent over to France did all the purchasing, and then arranged with the German authorities to get the stuff shipped. Raymond Foller actually got so frustrated by the Germans because they'd at a drop of a hat changed their mind. He'd be expecting his goods to be loaded up on a ship that he'd been told it was going to go on, and it was going to sail on this day, and then they'd just tell him, oh no, we've changed our mind, you can't, it's going to go another time. And he got very angry and actually told the Germans, look, I've had enough of this, I'm not going to do it anymore. Now they actually needed somebody to do that role. The controlling committee here needed somebody to do that role, and the Germans also needed somebody to do that to enable the population to be fed. Hence why then the problems that occurred after D-Day. So it was a little bit of a fractious relationship when it came to those things. But he did an amazing job. The fact that he managed to get so much food earlier, at that stage, it really organised himself very quickly after the Germans arrived, because unfortunately we can't grow enough crops here to be self-sustaining. So you have to ship in food. I mean, it's still the same today. Yeah,
and France itself was suffering from food shortages, so it was a little short of miraculous that Raymond Foller was able to source and obtain the food supplies and medical supplies that he was able. And just to emphasise the point for listeners, that there was no civilian traffic between here and mainland France. The civilian population on the Channel Islands had no free movement with France, so any transportation between the islands was effectively military driven, wasn't it? There was no civilian traffic between here and France.
No,
it was all military.
Yeah, absolutely. Albeit they were using ships that they'd either brought from Germany. They used barges that they'd brought from Germany, but also ships that they'd captured when they were coming through Europe. So you couldn't go out on your own boat without the Germans having
on your own fishing boat.
Yeah,
you had to be accompanied by a sentry, effectively.
Effectively, yeah, and that got stricter as time went on, but partly because of this escape that we talked about.
Yeah, and the traffic, the German military traffic between here and France was, I suppose, relatively light because they hadn't yet geared up to bring over the material for the Atlantic Wall. And when we reach that point, it's quite startling the amount of concrete and etc. or cement that was coming over then. So the traffic between here and France was relatively light to what it became.
Yeah, I mean they were gearing up for Operation Sea Lion as well, so they were very reluctant.
Oh, of course, as well. Yes,
they were reluctant to give up shipping space, etc. because they were still labouring under the idea that they were going to, go and invade England.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that's occurred to me, because we know there was a German naval signals bunker that was built in operational in 1944, which is quite some ways ahead. But German wireless traffic, was that able to be monitored this early? Had Enigma been? No, it hadn't. So one of the things that's always struck me is if you had RAF or Allied air activity over the islands trying to sink anything that moves, would the Allies be aware that they might be sinking boats, ships that were carrying supplies for the islanders? Do they think everything was fair game, or would they have gone for anything that was just overtly military? How would that have worked?
No, anything that was on
anything that moved.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way they could have told what it was. As I say, they flew all these reconnaissance flights, which often turned into attacking shipping that was coming between the French coast and here. They used to fly basically up and down a corridor from the south of England down to the top of the Brittany coast, backwards and forwards, just to see what shipping was coming out of St Malo and other ports as well, because they were keen to think those. They often went after German military ships as well.
Yeah, because I've always wondered that once Enigma had been cracked and Bletchley Park and other places were able to listen to the radio traffic, whether they sort of sifted it and said, don't go after this ship, it's carrying supplies in for the islanders, so they wouldn't have been discerning. It would have been just sink everything.
Absolutely. They were targets of opportunity as well. So you often see accounts as well where some of the squadrons that had been off to, say, bomb Cherbourg would, or St Malo, would, for whatever reason, if it was too cloudy over the target, couldn't see anything, would head back via the Channel Islands just to see if there was a target that they could usefully attack.
Yeah, and when you think about it in the wider picture, Battle of Britain's still going on, as we said. Blitz had just started, and Operation Sea Lion, the assumed invasion of the UK, is still very much on people's minds.
Yeah,
in the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't. I believe it wasn't officially cancelled. It just kept getting postponed until about 1942, and then.
I think really once Hitler had attacked Russia in June 1941, it was definitely off. One of the things now, because it's quite a big subject, Nick, is the continuing arrival of spies, sometimes alluded to commandos. These are young men born in the Channel Islands who must have been rounded up pretty quickly to bring together. But I'll get to that sort of more finessing point in a little while. We know that Martel and Mulholland had come over and been not caught, but they'd given themselves up. And again, this is rather interesting because they are then shipped off to the UK, to France, and then ultimately to Germany. And we know that some of their relatives were sent into exile in France. Desmond Mulholland's mother was sent into exile in France, where bizarrely she had to live 15 miles from the sea, lived in a hotel, and gave herself. Had to report to a police station on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly what was said. The 15 miles is interesting because all the reports talk about miles, but of course the Germans were focused on kilometres. But it does say 15 miles. I don't know why that's the case. Maybe they wanted to make sure that they understood exactly how far away from the coast they had to be.
And I'm doing some research on, as it happens, Desmond Mulholland's stepfather, who was an artist called Arthur Michael, that was his stepfather, although we're still trying to track down the fact that he'd actually married Desmond's mother. But he actually applied to the Germans to accompany his wife into exile. So he actually went to the Germans and said, my wife is being exiled in France. Can I accompany her? And that's just really quite interesting, because only in the last 24 hours have I found out, or it's been confirmed to me, that Arthur was actually Jewish. Now, this is an incredible thing to do, to sort of put yourself forward. Can I go with my wife into open-ended captivity at that time? Really.
Yeah,
really.
I mean, when they were exiled to France, they had no idea how long they were going to have to be there for, or whether they'd indeed be allowed back to the island by the Germans. Mm-hmm. As it happens, they were allowed back.
January 1941. They
returned.
They came back. Okay, so now we get to the 4th of September, where two gentlemen. I've got Nicol and Symes, and Nick, you might have to help me here because I've neglected to write their Christian names down, and it's gone from my mind completely. It is.
Gosh, I've now forgotten as well. Now you've said that.
Okay, well it'll come to us. So Nicol and Symes arrive in the early hours at 3 a.m. Their objective is to gather information regarding what food was getting through to Guernsey before winter set in, and which French port it was coming from. And again, the question in the UK was, are the islands able to support themselves food-wise? So the question coming from the UK is one of a civilian nature, I suppose, as much as a military one. How they got here, they were rowed ashore by a seaman from an MTB. They arrived at Petit Port on the Cherbourg Peninsula. Now, this, of course, is the location, the exact location that the Operation Ambassador, which we've covered off, had landed in. But Nicol and Symes say to themselves, well, the Germans may have mined the paths. It would have been a natural thing, so they came up a different path, but essentially the same location. And then they disperse. The two of them split up, and they go and stay in various places on the island. Nicol stays with his parents and wants to make contact with Ambrose Sherwell. Now, Ambrose Sherwell, if we just remind listeners, had made a controversial broadcast to islanders in the UK. It was carried on Berlin radio, and so Nicol's father contacts Ambrose Sherwell and says to him, have you got any message that my son can take back to the UK, take to the Home Office? And Sherwell's reply is really quite stark. He says something along the lines of, yes, stop sending people like Nicol and Symes, like your son, because they only cause inconvenience and upset for the administration. And I think he's talking about the Guernsey administration as much as the German administration, and are upsetting the local population. They're not serving any purpose as far as we're concerned. So the fact that these young men are turning up is seen to be a burden to the local authorities, and in some diaries this is coming out as quite openly. It's not seen as a help, is it? I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they were really concerned because obviously it's still early days for the occupation. They don't know how the Germans are going to react. Well, I say they don't know how they're going to react. The Germans reach a stage where they actually say, if this keeps happening, we'll take 20 of the most prominent members of the population and shoot them. So you can see why he's complaining about that. It also caused disruption because the Germans would stop people going into certain areas while they were searching for these people. They put out adverts in newspapers trying to encourage people to turn them in. Which then turned into an official notice with a promise of fair treatment later on if they surrendered. But the Germans were obsessed with the fact that there were English troops on the ground here hiding for a lot of the time when they actually weren't even here.
And they came ashore in civies. These people weren't coming ashore in military uniform. No,
which put them at great risk. So yeah, I've remembered the first names now. It's come back to me. It was Hubert
Nicol, and
James Symes.
So, of course, it is.
Yeah, they came ashore in civilian clothing, which led to them being accused of being spies. But we'll come on to that when we get to a bit later in the story, because their story runs across several months.
Yes, it does. And so they have it, just to go over their objectives again, it's to look at the food, supplies, da-di-da-di-da, and Symes, because they had split up. Symes is actually out in the rural area, which is not too far from the airport, and he's able to log the amount of German air traffic. But so they're here for only a short time, so they return to the Cherbourg Peninsula to be picked up. They'd already hidden a signalling torch on the way in, so they picked that up and signal, but their signals are not picked up. So to be clear here, an MTB did come back into very close to the cliffs to pick them up, didn't see their signalling. So the net effect of this, of course, is after 2 or 3 nights, they're stranded here. So they're stranded here without uniforms, could be shot as spies. So this is not good for them, and they split up, and but word gets around, as he said, that maybe they're here. So what the British do is they send somebody in uniform. How did that go, Nick? Not very well.
That didn't go well either, unfortunately. So that was Captain John Parker. I've got a photo that I'll share actually of him shortly after.
It's a great photograph as well.
Shortly after his capture, and you know, the Germans were worried about how long he'd been here as well. He'd only just got off the boat basically, because you know he'd fallen into a trench when he was getting to the top of the cliffs.
Yes, to finesse the local geography, both Nick and I would know this, is he was supposed to come ashore at a place called Le Gouffre, which has a path which he'd have known. They bring him ashore less than half a mile along the coast, but the topography was completely different. This is Corbière Point, where there used to be a sort of medieval fortification. The Germans have invested this. They built a trench system. Parker manages to scramble up the cliff in pitch daylight and literally falls into a trench on top of an ammunition box.
And almost on top of a German.
Yeah, so he's captured immediately. Okay, so he was a Guernseyman in as far as that he had been brought up on the island. He was serving with the South Lancashire Regiment, volunteered to come ashore. Now, one of the things, Nick, I'd like to ask you is, you know, we've seen Mulholland, we've seen Martyr, we've seen Nicole, we've seen Symes. Now we've got Parker. How did, in such a short time, did the British military authorities bring together these Guernseymen? I mean, you know, how did they know they had these Guernsey people embedded in I suppose the junior officer corps within these disparate units? I mean, how did they sort of sift people?
They had a number of them that were in the same units, or that, you know, they just asked around, because the units were fairly close knit, so they were able to identify people relatively easily. Hence why Hubert Nicholl's first visit was just, you know, days after the occupation.
Okay, so Parker, it looks like he arrived towards the 27th of, or on a particular date at the end of September, because his interrogation was really quite interesting, wasn't it? He had to try and prove that he'd only just arrived, and so he was able to give the German interrogators news from British newspapers that he could have only been seen if he'd been in London the day before or the day before that. It was really quite an interesting interrogation, wasn't it? We know quite a lot about it.
Yeah, that he was able to refer to some articles that had appeared in the Daily Sketch, a UK newspaper, which the Germans obviously then knew that if he'd seen that, he couldn't have been in Guernsey for very long. They were wanting to treat him as a spy and potentially shoot him, all because he didn't have a beret. He was actually wearing uniform, albeit he was wearing civilian shoes and had no beret, but they still wanted to shoot him as a spy to start off with. Also, I find this one a little bit curious, because he had no pay book or ID tags. Now, as my understanding, and I've checked with a few people, as an officer didn't generally carry a pay book. So obviously the Germans, for some reason, who were interrogating him, didn't know that, you know, he had a valid reason not to.
He was armed, I think. He had a revolver.
Yep. Now they said to him, well, look, we know you've been here for a while. This was before they talked to him, and he gave them stories about from the Daily Sketch, because we've captured some of your friends, and now at this point he was worried that it was Nicole and Symes who he was supposed to be looking for. It turned out not to be. So they basically,
because they would have known who he was,
yep,
and they would have indicated that, and so the Germans might have thought this is an operation wider than we thought. So Parker was very relieved to be introduced to people that didn't know him, which are these people were from Ambassador, which you'll explain.
Yeah, these guys were. So they paraded these chaps in front of him, obviously trying to, see if there was any hint of recognition. They perhaps had been in a unit together, operating on the island. He was quite relieved that it wasn't Nicole and Symes. In fact, it was some people left over from Operation Ambassador, who these were the chaps. If listeners have listened to the earlier podcasts, these were the chaps that couldn't swim to get back to the boat and were subsequently captured. So in the end, the Germans accepted this story that.
Well, there was also the strange thing that he had some white bread on him.
Yeah,
which was one of the deciding factors, it seems.
Yeah, I was just going to come to that. That was one of the other things that saved him, was that he had some white bread and it was still fresh.
Which couldn't have come from Guernsey.
Yeah, no, it couldn't come. It just wouldn't have happened. But also the other thing that saved him was that the Germans promptly started interrogating his father, who lived in the island, to see what he knew about what was going on, and that also helped to save him. I mean, Parker was sent off to Germany, although he was repatriated from Germany in 29th of April. The article appeared in the Guernsey Press, so the news got to Guernsey in April 1944. So it would have been late 43, early 44 that he would have been repatriated to the UK, obviously through illness.
Yeah, and in fact it was really quite callous of the Germans, because what they did is they went to Parker's father, as you say. Parker had been out serving in India in 1938, and Parker's father hadn't seen him since 1938, and they had them in the same building at the same time and wouldn't let them meet.
Yeah.
It's really quite callous, and of course then Parker Sr. had to wait till the liberation to catch up with his son again. It's just one of those petty things that the Germans, I suppose they saw it as. You could see their point, the Germans, in the wider scheme of things. They must have thought the island was overrun with spies and people.
Yeah, they were slightly obsessed with that. They also went to great lengths. So when the earlier Operation Ambassador was over, and they'd found equipment and captured those men, they actually reenacted what they'd done. They got them to reenact where they'd been and stuff like that. They were fascinated by that.
There's another thing here that Parker had a memorised code in his head that in the event of capture, he would pass that code on to people in captivity. Now, what was the purpose? How did that work, Nick?
Yeah, he had this code memorised, and when he got to prisoner of war camp, it was widely dispersed amongst the prisoners of war, and used to send information back to Britain, but also to facilitate escapes as well, and that was used widely.
So what was the purpose of this? What information did it carry, or was it a way of just for people that managed to get back to the UK, what proved that their provenance and themselves, they weren't spies? Or
no, I think it was so they could get information out, because of course they were allowed to write Red Cross letters as prisoners of war. So using that code, they could send messages, by writing certain things that actually meant something completely different.
So Parker came looking for Symes and Nicol, but also I think it was also to scope out something that was in the wind. Another one of their UK operations of the Channel Islands, Operation Tomato. What were the aims and the reasons for eventual sort of cancellation of this operation?
Yeah, so Operation Tomato was really sort of 4 operations actually. That this was the first of the let's take back the Channel Islands operations that they started planning. They were going to use 2 forces of 750 men to attack Jersey and Guernsey, and 250 men each for Sark and Alderney, and they were going to destroy as much as possible, take prisoners of war, or indeed try and hold the islands. It was a directive came from Churchill. Mountbatten was also involved. In the end, they changed it to attack the airfield in Guernsey, which was the same objective as Ambassador, the earlier operation, had. They did think about holding the islands for 24 hours. I think that wouldn't have gone down very well, because there would have been likely be some very severe reprisals by the Germans on the civilian population after they'd gone. But also, can you imagine how demoralising for the civilian population that would be if they turned up? There would have been inevitably been lots of civilian casualties if they'd held the island for 24 hours and then just gone. That would have been.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Mountbatten there. In terms of over the course of the war, there wasn't anything he didn't agree to, really. He agreed to anything and everything.
Yeah, he did. He did. We'll come on to those in
ensuing years.
In later years, yeah.
But just to go over this, I mean, two forces of 750 men. One to cover. 750 men to go to Jersey, 750 men to go to Guernsey, and then 250 men for Sark and Alderney. I mean, just the logistics alone, you need the shipping, etc., etc. This is a lot of men to put ashore. Now, the German force complement at that time would have been equal to that. Is
around about in Guernsey, depending on when exactly they were going to carry out the operation. You were around probably the 750 mark, maybe a little bit more. Likewise in Jersey, but they decided not to go ahead with this, and it turned into it was going to be a tip and run
raid, yeah.
Just really to make the Germans nervous, which is what a lot of the Commando raids were doing. Was to make them, you're standing out there on your own on guard duty or whatever near the coast, and you're wondering whether you're going to get attacked or shot or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's really just feeling their way here during the war, right? We must remind ourselves it's very, very early stages. I want to sort of just break away from the, Parker, etc., and look at one of the things that our diarist, Reverend Ord, talked about. Is the effect that if we just look in a wider sense, is that Guernsey and Jersey didn't have SS stationed here. SS were in Alderney, but the Gestapo did have a presence here early on in the war, didn't they?
A small presence, yeah. They often get the German secret field police often get mistaken for the Gestapo, because they wore similar civilian clothes, right?
The archetypal leather coat.
And hat. So they I think that just became used as the locals' parlance for anybody that was vaguely involved with the German police at the time.
Okay, so we've got Gestapo on the island, but they're a sort of Gestapo light in a way, aren't they? They're not the full cream version.
Yeah.
Okay. because this is one of the things that when I take tours over here, people sort of want to know, what was the Gestapo activity like, and really it was a sort of CID more than anything, wasn't it? News from other theatres here. What's sort of going on? A German soldier back on Guernsey tells a Guernseyman he has regular contacts about his leave in Frankfurt, so his hometown Frankfurt, and the Allies are already starting to bomb German cities.
Yeah, so the front pages of the Guernsey newspapers have the German propaganda that Germany's not been bombed at all, and then this chap's talking to a German that he came into contact with regularly, who's just come back from Frankfurt and was complaining about the fact that he'd been spending a lot of his time on his leave in air raid shelters because of the bombing.
Yes, this is one of the things that occurs certainly in Reverend Ord's diaries, because he was a fluent German speaker, and German officers often, when visiting him at the church, confided in him that both they and non-commissioned officers and rank and file were going back to Germany. They'd left Germany, gone through France, etc., come to the Channel Islands, they're listening to all of the German propaganda, they're listening to, Battle of Britain, Blitz, etc., and then they're making their way back to Germany, through the rail network, and they're coming across these scenes of devastation, which they'd been told nothing of. They're finding out that their own families and such were under attack. It was total war.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the war progressed, it got more and more difficult for them to go on leave from Guernsey because of the build up towards D-Day. But even in 1943, it was the rail network was falling apart.
Yeah,
they were.
It was quite a culture shock for Germans here, thinking, we're on the crest of a wave, and then only to go back home and find out things weren't going as well as they'd been told. Okay, so we're just sort of in the final few minutes of this September 1940 edition of Islands at War. Do the usual plug for your blog, Nick, Island Fortress. It's doing rather well at the moment.
It's getting quite a lot of hits at the moment, so I'm really pleased with that.
And then Island Fortress, this podcast, it can be found on Gnet Radio, Mixcloud. Gnet Radio is sponsored and funded by Guernsey Arts, and Gnet Radio has a continual music presence by simply going to Gnet Radio, listen live. It has a listen again facility on Mixcloud, and there are two. I can't plug all of the programs, but certainly if you're interested in post-punk, Martin Tolcher's Songs from Under the Floorboards, and a great array other presenters, Simon Charlesworth, etc. So it's well worth sort of negotiating your way around the website. I'll be back live when we're looking at our producer when some technical issues are sorted out. If you've got any questions for Nick and I at Islands at War, you can email occupied@gnetradio.com. You've been doing some interviewing, which I don't think you can talk about at the moment.
No, can't talk about that.
We will be able to talk about that in due course. Can we talk about, just briefly again, return to Lydia and James's podcast here, which will be streaming soon.
Yep.
It's to do with Bomber. Could you give us a little shout out for them?
Yeah, absolutely. They're doing a podcast. I think they've recorded the first one now, and it should be out in a couple of weeks. It's called Never Mind the Dam Busters, because obviously everybody focuses on the Dam Busters, and not all of the other things that went on during World War II and Bomber Command, etc. They're both extremely knowledgeable. It will be really, really good, I'm sure. And
both you and Lydia are writing books at the moment. You have works in progress, and we'll be able to talk about those. So there's a lot going on. Myself, Keith Mengele, I'm a accredited tour guide. I have a website called Guernsey Walking Tours, and I'll be posting up details of tours that will be putting on this summer and this autumn. I'm going to try and leverage Nick into accompanying them, and possibly we might be able to do something charity-wise, on at least.
I'm sure we can. Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
We're going to have a little bit of a look ahead to October 1940, our next episode, which will be out in a fortnight's time. So we'll be looking at the boats removed from sea in case of escape, limpets being gathered vigorously, clothing rationing scheme starts. We have a new military commandant on the island. We follow up on the Nicole and Symes capture, surrender, etc. And our sources have been diaries from Reverend Ord, Ralph Durand, also a fascinating book called No News from Guernsey by Peter Jesson, and a really rather good overview of the occupation by Cruikshank. And again, I've neglected to write his first name.
Charles
Cruikshank, that's it. Thank you, Nick. So it's good night from me and good night from Nick, and we'll catch you in a fortnight's time. Thank you for listening.
Cheers.
Good night. Yep. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. 1 hour.